Respect your elders. Don't be difficult. Don't talk about sex, politics, or pay. If you don't have anything nice to say, then just be quiet. We've all been told this by one adult or another. Hell, we probably at one point even told our own children this. On the surface, it makes sense. We obviously wouldn't want everyone screaming all the time, right? Wrong. That's you, going to the extreme end of the spectrum you created in the realm of imagination we all seem to get lost in. It would actually look like a collection of ideas centered specifically around the people living the same caliber of life that you're living. Experiencing the same woes and worries, the same bosses making billions while you count pennies, the same financial aspirations that begin to feel more and more out of reach, the burden of car troubles, roof leaks, and dues for baseball, band, and braces. Yet somehow, we've been conditioned to believe that using our voices is frowned upon. Who are we being quiet for? Who are we trying not to piss off? Better yet, who does our silence benefit? Who does it hurt? Whose peace are we protecting? When did we allow our silence to minimize us to an imprisoned mental echo chamber that made us only see our perspective of things? Because silence doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes silence means I don't want to argue. Sometimes it means I don't want to lose my job. I don't want my family to be mad at me. I don't want my friends looking at me differently. I don't want to be the difficult one, the angry one, the dramatic one, the one who always has something to say. Sometimes silence simply means I don't want to find out what disagreeing with you is going to cost me. But what happens when everybody in the room is doing the same thing? How many conversations never happen because everyone is waiting for someone else to go first? How many ideas have we mistaken for popular simply because the people who disagreed with them were quiet? How many times have you looked around a room, saw no one objecting, and thought, well, maybe it's just me? We're terrified of being the person who disagrees with everyone. Yet once we finally find people who agree with us, suddenly we don't want to disagree with them either. We find our people, our political party, our community, our side. And now the silence has a different job description. We aren't keeping quiet to avoid the opposition anymore. We're keeping quiet because disagreeing with our own people could mean questioning where we belong. And that creates a contradiction. We say we want people willing to listen to different perspectives, but changing your mind makes you weak. We say politicians should work together, then call them traitors when they cross party lines. We complain that nothing gets done in Washington while treating compromise like surrender. We tell people to stand for something, but when they stand somewhere we don't like, suddenly they need to sit down and shut up. So what exactly do we do or want from each other? Because democracy requires disagreement. It also requires compromise. It requires enough courage to tell the room that you think it's wrong, and enough humility to admit when maybe the room knows something you don't. That means the question isn't simply whether you speak up or stay quiet. Why did you choose either one? When you stay quiet, are you protecting peace or protecting your place in the room? When you refuse to compromise, are you protecting a principle or protecting your pride? When you change your mind, did someone manipulate you? Or did you learn something you didn't know yesterday? And maybe the most uncomfortable question of all of these, if nobody from your side would never know what you really thought, would you still believe the exact same thing? Sit with that. Because today we're digging into the history, psychology, and politics of silence, conformity, and compromise. Who taught us that being quiet was polite? Who decided that disagreement was disrespectful? When did compromise become weakness? And how did we get to a place where speaking against the other side is celebrated, but speaking against our own can cost us our place in the room? Maybe we've spent so much time fighting for the right to speak that we forgot to ask, who taught us when we shouldn't? You know how we do it here. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I want to know why you think it. I want the history they left out, the psychology happening quietly in the background, and the politics that turned all of it into power. So get comfortable. Bring your opinions. Bring your questions. And hell, bring the thing you've been scared to say out loud. Welcome to You Ought to Know Betta. I'm AJ. You might know me as Political Unicorn. And this is the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. Now let's talk about why the hell everybody keeps telling us to shut up. Before we can even establish boundaries around conformity, we're already silenced. Think about how early it starts. A 4-year-old has no idea what conformity is. They don't understand social hierarchy, group expectations, or why challenging certain people is different from challenging others. They just know what happens when they talk back. Because I said so. Stay in a child's place. Don't question adults. Stop being difficult. Now, I'm not saying children should be running the house. I have children. Absolutely not. We'd be eating candy for dinner, nobody would have a bedtime, and somebody would have purchased a horse by Tuesday. Think about what we're actually learning in those moments. Before we understand why a rule exists, we understand who is allowed to question it. Before we understand authority, we know who has it. Before we have enough life experience to decide whether something is fair, unfair, right, or wrong, we understand that challenging certain people can cost us something. Maybe it's punishment. Maybe it's approval. Maybe it's being called disrespectful or difficult, hard-headed, or a problem. Eventually, we don't need someone standing over us saying, "Be quiet." We know when to do it. Then those rooms change. You go from home to school and suddenly you're raising your hand before you speak. You learn which teachers welcome questions and which ones hear questions as disrespect. You get your first job and realize there are things everybody complains about in the parking lot that nobody seems willing to say when the boss walks into the room. Then we build relationships. We join churches. We find friend groups. We develop political identities. We find communities where people think like us and places where belonging feels good. And we start reading those rooms too. Can I say this here? Who's going to get mad? Am I going to look stupid? Is everybody going to think differently of me? Saying what I actually think worth what might happen after I say it? Most of us probably think we would know if we were conforming. Surely, I would notice if I were changing my behavior just to make everybody else comfortable, right? Probably not. Conformity doesn't require you to believe everyone around you is right. Hell, sometimes you can know they're wrong and still decide saying so isn't worth what comes next. Psychologists call this normative social influence. Human beings want acceptance. We want relationships. We want community. We want to belong. So sometimes we adjust what we say or what we do to fit the expectations of the people around us, even when privately we don't agree with them. And before you decide that could never be you, make it personal. You're sitting at work and your boss says something you completely disagree with. Do you correct them? Your mother says something crazy at Thanksgiving. Do you correct her? Your pastor says it from the pulpit. Do you question it? Your friends are all sitting around laughing at something you don't think is funny. Do you tell them? Your political party takes a position that makes absolutely no sense to you. Do you say that publicly when everyone you've spent the last 10 years agreeing with is watching? Maybe. But notice how many times you had to calculate the room before answering. The calculation is the point. Nobody had to take your voice. Nobody had to threaten you. Nobody had to pass a law telling you that you couldn't speak. You considered the consequences of speaking and decided for yourself whether your voice was worth the cost. Now imagine everybody else in the room doing the exact same thing. 20 people can privately disagree with something while each one looks around believing they are the only person who feels that way. Nobody speaks because nobody else is speaking. And because nobody speaks, everybody assumes everyone agrees. Silence has now created evidence for something that may not even be true. So how much of what we call a popular opinion is actually popular? How many times have we mistaken silence for agreement? And if an entire room can privately know something feels wrong while publicly going along with it anyway, how far are people willing to go just to avoid being the one person who says, I disagree? A psychologist by the name of Solomon Asch decided to find out. That name, Solomon Asch, does it sound familiar? Remember last episode when we talked about Solomon Asch and those lines? If you missed it, Asch put one participant in a room with a group of people who were secretly in on the experiment. Everyone was shown a line and asked which of the other 3 lines matched it. The answer was pretty obviously. But eventually, the rest of the group intentionally started giving the wrong answer. And you know what happened? People conformed. Some went along with an answer they could literally see was wrong because everyone else in the room was saying it was right. But I want to revisit that experiment for a second, because there was something Asch gave those participants that we don't always get in real life. An answer we can see. You could look at the lines. You could compare them. You had something outside of the group to measure the group against. But what happens when you don't? What happens when you walk into the room and there is no answer sitting in front of you? No ruler, no fact that you can immediately verify. Nothing telling you whether what you're seeing, thinking, or feeling is right. Now, you have to look somewhere else. And where do we usually look? At each other. Before Asch ever gave us those lines, psychologist Muzafer Sharif put people in a dark room and showed them a tiny point of light. He asked them how far the light moved. Except the light didn't move at all. It was an optical illusion called the autokinetic effect. In a completely dark room, a stationary point of light can appear to move because your brain doesn't have another visual reference point to measure its position against. The people in the experiment didn't know that. When Sharif asked them individually how far the light had moved, their answers varied. One person might think it barely moved, while another thought it moved much farther. Then he put them together. Now they could hear each other's answers. Over repeated trials, their estimates began moving closer and closer together. Eventually, the group developed a shared range for how far they believed the light was moving. But remember, the light never moved. Nobody in that room actually knew the answer because the question itself was based on something that wasn't happening. They created the reference point for each other. Think about how much of life works exactly that way. What does successful look like? How much money is enough? What does a good parent look like? What makes someone respectable? What does poor look like? What does patriotism look like? What opinions are acceptable to say out loud? Nobody handed us a ruler at birth with any of this marked on it. We learned by looking around. Our parents gave us measurements. Our teachers gave us measurements. Religion gave us measurements. Our communities gave us measurements. Politics, television, social media, all gave us measurements. Then we start measuring ourselves against them. Psychology calls part of this informational social influence. When we aren't sure what is correct, we use other people as information. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. If something starts smoking under the hood of my car, I'm going to ask somebody who knows more about cars than I do. I'm not about to stand over there Googling engine diagrams pretending I suddenly went to mechanic school. That would just be stupid. The problem comes when the people we're using as reference points don't know either. Now I'm looking at you, you're looking at her, she's looking at him, and he's looking back at me. And somehow, all four of us walk away believing somebody in that circle knew what the hell was going on. So go back to Ash. His participants had a line they could use to challenge the group. Sharif took the ruler away. And once there was nothing else to measure against, people began measuring against each other. Now think about silence. If I'm trying to figure out what is acceptable and nobody around me objects, your silence becomes information to me. I assume you're okay with it. You assume I'm okay with it. Neither one of us says anything because each of us thinks the other person has already accepted it. Eventually, we aren't just following the norm. We're helping create it. So when we say, that's just how things are, maybe we should ask one more question. Who gave us that ruler? That would be much easier to answer if somebody actually handed it to you. Most of the rules we live by were never formally explained to us. Nobody sat down at 5 years old and presented a PowerPoint on acceptable human behavior. We watched. You learn pretty quickly that you probably shouldn't stand backward in an elevator, staring directly into everyone's face. Nobody had to make that a law. You learned how close was too close when talking to a stranger. You learn that there are clothes you wear to a funeral and clothes you wear to the beach. You learn that asking someone how much money they made can make a room uncomfortable as hell. Where did you learn that? Probably everywhere and nowhere. Family, friends, school, religion, television, neighborhoods, communities, all participate in socialization. We learn the behaviors, expectations, and values that help us function within the groups and society around us. Some of those lessons are directly taught. Say thank you. Cover your mouth. Don't interrupt. Others we learn by watching what happens when somebody breaks them. Nobody has to tell you that something is embarrassing if you watch an entire room react when someone does it. The laugh, the stare, the awkward silence, the sudden change in everyone's face, the conversation that happens after they leave. Those reactions teach too. It's part of what social norms do. They give us expectations for how people are supposed to behave within particular situations and groups. And norms aren't automatically bad. Imagine trying to exist in a world where nobody shared any expectations about anything. Everybody cuts every line. Nobody understands personal space. Nobody waits their turn to speak. Every trip to Kroger becomes the Hunger Games. We need some shared expectations to live around one another. But not every norm is about keeping society from descending into chaos. Some tell us what is polite. Some tell us what is respectable or embarrassing. Some tell us what should remain private. And some tell us when we've crossed the invisible line between having an opinion and becoming a problem. Think about the language we use when somebody crosses it. She's doing too much. He always has to make everything political. Why can't she just let it go? This isn't the time or the place. Don't make a scene. Pick your battles. Just be the bigger person. None of those sentences technically mean you are not allowed to speak. That would almost be easier and would end this show a lot quicker. But they wouldn't be true. Instead, they tell you something about what speaking will mean about you. You're difficult, you're dramatic, confrontational, or inappropriate. You're the reason everyone is uncomfortable now. So you start learning another set of rules. Not just what you can't say, but when you can say what you can say. How loudly can you say it? How angry are you allowed to look when you say it? How many times you're allowed to bring it up before everybody decides you need to move on? How nicely you have to package your disagreement before somebody is willing to hear it. And nobody has to enforce every one of these rules every time. Eventually, you know them. You walk into the room already carrying them with you. That doesn't mean every time we choose not to speak, we've been oppressed by some invisible social force. Sometimes shutting up is the mature thing to do. Every thought doesn't need an audience. Every disagreement doesn't deserve a confrontation. There are absolutely moments when keeping the peace matters more than proving a point. But that brings us back to the question we started with. Whose peace? Because keeping the peace only tells us that conflict was avoided. It doesn't tell us whether the thing underneath the conflict was resolved. And maybe that's why some of the rules we learned as children deserve another look as adults. Don't be rude. Makes sense. Don't be cruel. Makes sense. Listen when other people speak. Makes sense. But somewhere along the way, a lot of us learned to put don't make people uncomfortable in the same category. Those are not the same rule. Discomfort isn't always harm. Disagreement isn't automatically disrespect. And being easy to deal with isn't the same thing as being good. So before you decide that speaking would be rude, difficult, inappropriate, or unnecessary, maybe ask yourself where you learned the rule you're about to obey. Then ask whether you still agree with it. That sounds simple until the room belongs to someone you love. You spend a lot of time talking about peer pressure like it's something we're supposed to graduate from. Your friends offered you a cigarette behind the school. You said no. Somebody played an after-school special soundtrack, and congratulations, you survived peer pressure. Then adulthood happens. And apparently, we're all magically immune. Sure. We still want somewhere to belong. We find families we feel connected to, churches where people share our faith, and friend groups where we don't have to explain ourselves. Communities built around our experiences, political parties that seem to represent our values. Eventually, some of those memberships become part of the answer to a much bigger question. Who are you? Oh, I'm a Democrat, a Republican, a Christian, an atheist, a feminist, a conservative, a union worker, an activist. Those are just descriptions of things we do. They can become pieces of how we understand ourselves in the world. Psychologists Henry Tajfel and John Turner developed social identity theory around this idea. That a part of our self-concept can come from the social groups we belong to. And belonging feels good. There's absolutely nothing inherently wrong with that. Community gives us connection. Shared identity can give us language for experiences we thought nobody else understood. It can give us support, purpose, and people willing to stand behind us when standing alone would be a hell of a lot harder. But now disagree with them. Not the people across the street, your people. Say something at Thanksgiving that challenges the political beliefs that your entire family shares. Question something your religious community believes. Tell your activist friends you think the movement got something wrong. Tell people in your political party that the politician everybody is defending actually deserves criticism. Watch how quickly a disagreement about an idea can become a question about you. So whose side are you on? I thought you were one of us. You sound just like them. There it is. Them. You barely need an explanation for them, because once we've divided the room into us and them, everybody already knows whose belongs where. Tajfel's work showed just how little it can take for people to begin making distinctions between an in-group and an out-group. In his minimal group experiments, participants were divided into groups using criteria that were intentionally trivial. Even those thin, meaningless group assignments could produce favoritism toward members of one's own group. Now give the group something that actually matters. A history, values, religion, race, a class, a political ideology, a shared enemy, years of experiences together, a name you proudly call yourself. Walking away from a disagreement gets a little harder when it feels like you're walking away from a piece of yourself. And that doesn't mean group identity turns everybody into some mindless follower. Social identity theory doesn't tell us that people automatically obey their group or that disagreement disappears once we belong somewhere. People challenge their own groups all the damn time. But it does give us something worth considering about the cost of that disagreement. If belonging to a group has become part of how I understand who I am, criticism from outside the group can feel different than criticism from inside. And admitting that my group is wrong about something may require more than changing my opinion about one issue. I might have to reconsider something about us. Maybe even something about me. That puts a different weight behind the question. Do I agree? Because sometimes there's another question sitting quietly up underneath that one. If I don't, do I still belong here? Think about how often we demand loyalty from people we supposedly want to think independently. We want politicians who stand on principle, but we also want them to vote with our side. We want friends who tell us when we're wrong until they tell us we're wrong. We tell people to think for themselves, then get suspicious when their independent thinking takes them somewhere we didn't. Hell, sometimes the quickest way to become unpopular with the other side is to attack them. The quickest way to become unpopular with your own side is to question them. Maybe that's why some of the hardest things to say aren't said in a room full of enemies. They're said in a room full of people you desperately want to keep calling your own. So what happens? Because eventually, somebody has to leave the dinner table, the workplace, and the friend group, and take that uncomfortable opinion outside. Now everybody else has to deal with it. In April of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was sitting in a Birmingham jail after being arrested during demonstrations against segregation. While he was there, 8 white Alabama clergymen published a statement criticizing the demonstrations. And I want you to hear what they were actually saying. They were writing a defense of segregation. They described racial problems as legitimate concerns. They appealed to law enforcement to remain calm. They even acknowledged that people had the right to pursue their courses and causes through the courts. They just didn't like the demonstrations. They called them, quote, unwise and untimely. They wanted negotiation, the courts, local leadership. Essentially, there were acceptable ways to challenge the system, and marching through Birmingham wasn't one of them. King wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail in response. And his answer wasn't simply, fuck your feelings, we're protesting anyway. He explained why the demonstrations were happening. King described 4 steps in a nonviolent campaign. collecting facts to determine whether injustice existed, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. Direct action wasn't supposed to be comfortable. That was the point. It created enough tension that an issue people had been willing to avoid could no longer be ignored. That changes the way we usually tell this story. Because today, the civil rights movement is safe. We put King quotes on Facebook in January. We put his face all over t-shirts in February. Children color pictures of him in school. Politicians from damn near every ideology quote him when it serves whatever point they're making. We know how the story ends. The people living through it didn't. To them, streets were being disrupted. Businesses were being boycotted. Demonstrators were being arrested. People were being asked to confront segregation when many would have preferred gradual change, negotiation, or simply more time. And King had something to say about time too. Wait had been the answer Black Americans had heard repeatedly. Wait for attitudes to change. Wait for the courts. Wait for the right political moment. Wait until people are ready. But waiting isn't neutral. When one group gets to remain comfortable while another group continues living under the thing everybody has agreed should eventually change. That doesn't mean every protest is justified because somebody calls it justice. It doesn't mean disruption automatically makes a cause righteous. History has plenty of people who were loud, disruptive, and wrong. Jake Lang. The harder question is who gets to decide when disruption has become inappropriate? The people protesting? The people being inconvenienced? The government? The people benefiting from whatever is being challenged? Because I agree with what you're asking for, but not how you're asking for it can be a legitimate criticism. It can also become a very convenient way to support change only after it stops requiring anything from you. And suddenly, be polite isn't just something we tell children. Sometimes it's something society tells people who are making it uncomfortable. It can't finish a conversation, but it can surely force one. At some point, somebody has to sit across the table from the person they were just yelling at and figure out what happens next. Workers learned that long before most of us were arguing with strangers in comment sections. Industrialization created enormous wealth in the United States, but the people producing that wealth often worked long hours under dangerous conditions for low pay. Individual workers had very little leverage to change any of it. Think about that power difference. One worker walks into the boss's office and says, "Hey, I deserve better pay." The boss just says, "No. I need shorter hours." The boss just says, "No. This machine is dangerous." Well, just quit. Speaking up doesn't mean much when the person you're speaking to can replace you, so workers organized. And that changed the conversation because a complaint from one worker could be ignored. Hundreds or thousands of workers refusing to work could shut production down. Strikes were disruptive on purpose. They cost businesses money. They interrupted production. They inconvenienced people who weren't necessarily involved in the original dispute. Some labor conflicts became violent, and governments sometimes sent police, state militias, or federal troops into confrontations between workers and employers. So here we are again. Order versus disruption. But labor gives us another piece of this that I don't want to miss. The strike wasn't always the end goal. The bargaining table was. Collective bargaining gave workers a way to negotiate as a group over wages, hours, and working conditions. And negotiation means neither side is guaranteed everything it walked into the room demanding. That's compromise. Which is funny because we talk about compromise now like it means somebody didn't believe hard enough. You folded. You sold out. You gave them what they wanted. Maybe. There are absolutely compromises that abandon the people they were supposed to protect. History doesn't require us to romanticize every deal somebody signed just because both sides shook hands afterward. But compromise can also mean you had enough power to make someone who previously didn't have to listen to you negotiate. That's different. If I ask for 10 things and you have enough power to give me 0, that's not compromise. That's you telling me no. If I organize enough people that you now have to sit across from us and we leave with 6, we can argue all day about whether 6 was enough, but the relationship has changed. Now think about how strange our expectations are. We praise people for refusing to be silent. We praise them for standing their ground. We praise them for fighting. Then when the fight finally creates an opportunity to negotiate, we sometimes punish them for negotiating. So what exactly was the fight supposed to accomplish? Compromise doesn't automatically mean courage, and refusing to compromise doesn't automatically mean principle. Sometimes refusing to move is a conviction. Sometimes it's ego. Sometimes taking half today creates the power to fight for the other half tomorrow. Sometimes taking half leaves somebody behind who couldn't afford for you to settle. The word itself doesn't tell us whether the decision was right. We have to look at what was surrendered, what was gained, who had power going into the room, and who had more of it when they walked back out. Maybe the opposite of silence isn't refusing to bend. Sometimes it's finally having enough of a voice that somebody has to bargain with you. Which brings us to our favorite part, of course, Washington. Because apparently we want our politicians to compromise. Until they do. Then somebody sold us out. Think about the language we use around politicians who refuse to move. They stood their ground. They didn't cave. They fought for us. They refused to back down. Sounds great. Now imagine 535 people entering Congress with that exact philosophy. Nobody moves. Nobody gives anything else. Nobody accepts less than everything they originally wanted. Congratulations. You have principles. You do not, however, have a functioning legislature. The structure of American government practically guarantees that people who disagree will eventually have to work together. A bill has to survive the House and the Senate. The House and Senate may be controlled by different parties. Even when one party controls both chambers, its own members don't necessarily agree. Then legislation generally has to make it past a president who may belong to the other party. The Senate adds another complication because most legislation can be blocked by a filibuster, unless supporters can reach the votes needed for cloture. So compromise isn't some weird malfunction of American politics. Sometimes it's the only way anything gets through the building. But voters don't experience politics as a legislative flowchart. We experience it as identity. We just talked about that. My side, your side, our values, their agenda. Remember? So when somebody from our side compromises, we aren't always evaluating the agreement by asking what they gained and what they surrendered. Sometimes we're asking why they gave them anything. And politicians know that. A legislator doesn't only have to think about whether a compromise could produce a better law. They have to think about what voters back home will call them for making it. Weak, a rhino, a dino, a sellout, a traitor. Not conservative enough, not progressive enough. Suddenly, the social pressure we've spent this entire episode talking about isn't sitting at Thanksgiving dinner anymore. It's sitting in Congress. Except now there are elections attached to it, and I don't want to pretend their answer is that everybody should just meet in the middle. The middle isn't automatically right. If one person says 2 + 2 is 4, and another says it's 10, compromise doesn't make it 7. There are issues involving fundamental rights where halfway can mean asking someone else to surrender a part of a right so everybody can say they got something. There are also politicians who hide behind the word compromise because they don't want to take a difficult vote. So refusing to compromise can absolutely be principled. The problem is that compromise can also be necessary to govern, which leaves us with a question voters don't really like answering. What do we actually want them to do when those two things collide? Because we can't simultaneously demand that politicians never surrender our position and demand that 535 people representing hundreds of millions of Americans somehow reach ours. Something eventually has to move. The question isn't whether politicians should compromise. It's what we're willing to let them compromise on. And maybe more importantly, what happens to them when we decide they chose wrong. Because politicians read the room too. We like to imagine an elected official sitting in their office with the Constitution in one hand and their conscience in the other, carefully deciding what's best for the country. But there are some other people in that room. Voters, party leaders, donors, activists, interest groups, colleagues, lobbyists. And the person considering running against you in the next primary. Suddenly, vote your conscience gets a little more complicated. Political parties need some degree of loyalty to function. That's not inherently sinister. If voters elect a group of people because they promise to pursue a particular agenda, it would be pretty damn strange if those politicians got to Washington and immediately abandoned it. Parties organize legislatures. They build coalitions. They decide priorities. They help voters understand what candidates generally stand for. But belonging to a party also creates expectations. Vote against your party once and maybe you're independent. Do it enough and people start asking whether you belong there at all. And American elections give that question some teeth. Because many members of Congress don't only have to worry about losing to the other party in November. They have to survive their own party first. Primaries can create a very different political calculation. Imagine you're a Republican representing a safely Republican district. Your biggest electoral threat may not be a Democrat. It may be another Republican telling your voters that you aren't conservative enough. Same thing can happen to a Democrat in a heavily Democratic district, where a challenger can argue that the incumbent isn't progressive enough or hasn't fought hard enough for the party's priorities. Now go back to compromise. You can negotiate a bill with the other side and come home saying, I got 70% of what we wanted. Your opponent gets to say, I would have fought for 100. Guess which one fits better on a campaign sign? The compromise may have actually produced something. The refusal may have produced absolutely nothing. But nothing can be politically easier to defend than explaining why you gave the other side 30%. And voters participate in that too. We can't spend every election rewarding the person who promises never to bend and then act shocked when the people we elect refuse to bend. But there is another side to this. Sometimes voters are right to punish compromise. If I elected you because you promised to protect something I consider fundamental and you trade it away the second negotiations get difficult, I don't owe you applause because you technically got a bill passed. Your job isn't simply to make deals. Representation means something should be worth fighting for. So we're back in that uncomfortable place again. When is refusing to move conviction? When is it performance, compromise governing, or surrender? There isn't a psychological study or political theory that's going to hand us a universal answer because the answer depends partly on what is being negotiated. But we can stop pretending politicians make those decisions in a vacuum. They're watching us too. They see what gets applause, what gets booed, what gets primaried, who gets called a traitor. They see which clips go viral. They know which vote they're going to have to explain when they get home. So when we ask why Washington has become so unwilling to compromise, maybe we shouldn't only point towards Washington. Some of the people they're afraid of pissing off are sitting right here with us. But laws weren't the only thing protecting that version of normal. Sometimes the boundary was enforced with violence. I don't want us to clean that up by talking about racism only through legislation, because that makes American history sound much more orderly than it actually was. After the Civil War, Black Americans weren't simply told they shouldn't vote. They were beaten and killed for trying. During Reconstruction, white supremacist organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan, used terror against black voters, political leaders, teachers, and organizers. Violence was also directed at white Republicans and others who supported Reconstruction and black political participation. Think about what violence does beyond the person being attacked. If somebody beats a man because he registered to vote, they haven't only sent a message to him. Everybody saw what happened. If a family is terrorized because they challenge the racial order, everyone in that community now has another piece of information available when deciding whether they should challenge it too. You don't have to attack everybody when everybody knows what happened to the person who went first. Lynching later became one of the most horrific tools of racial terror in America. Thousands of people were lynched between the end of the Reconstruction era and the middle of the 20th century. And still, to this day, the overwhelming majority in documented racial terror lynchings was being black. And those killings weren't always hidden. Some were public spectacles. Crowds gathered, photographs were taken, postcards were made, bodies displayed. That isn't simply murder. That's murder with a message. It tells an entire population where the boundaries are and what crossing them can cost. Voting had boundaries. Economic success had boundaries. Where you lived had boundaries. Whom you could marry had boundaries. How you interacted with white people had boundaries. Even accusations that a black person had violated racial customs could become deadly. Now go back to the beginning of this episode. Know your place. Those words hit a little differently when place has historically been enforced by more than disapproval. And the pressure didn't stop with black Americans. White people who cross racial boundaries could face consequences too. Civil rights workers were threatened, beaten, and murdered. White people who challenged segregation alongside black people could face social ostracism, economic retaliation, and violence alongside the black activists whose rights they were defending. In 1964, civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner disappeared in Mississippi while working to register black voters. Chaney was black. Goodman and Schwerner were white. All three were murdered. Their deaths weren't proof that every white Southerner supported segregation. Quite the opposite. They remind us that racial systems sometimes had to pressure members of the dominant group to conform to. You could reject the norm, but rejecting it could cost you. And that's something our earlier conversation about conformity doesn't fully capture if we leave it sitting inside of a psychology study. There's an enormous difference between changing your answer because everyone else in the room disagrees with you and changing your behavior because you've watched what happens to people who don't. One is a social pressure. The other can be survival. That's why we have to be careful when we look backward and ask why more people didn't speak. Sometimes silence protected comfort. Sometimes it protected privilege and belonging. And sometimes silence protected your life. None of that makes silence harmless. It tells us why breaking it could require so much. And maybe there's another reason America's celebrations of dissent can feel a little dishonest. We love the person who eventually stood up, who put their face in textbooks and on t-shirts. We build monuments. We quote them after they die. What we don't always spend enough time talking about is what America was willing to do to them when they refused to sit back down. And people learned from that. Of course they did. If challenging the social order could cost you your job, your home, your safety, or your life, surviving within it meant learning how to move through it, how to speak, how to dress, how to respond to authority, when to look someone in the eyes, when not to, when to swallow what you actually wanted to say because getting home safely mattered more than winning the argument. For Black Americans, respectability became tangled up in survival in ways that are easy to judge generations later. Dress well, speak properly, don't give them a reason, be twice as good, don't embarrass us, don't make us look bad. Some of you heard versions of those things growing up. So did I. And not necessarily because the person saying them believed there was something wrong with you. Sometimes they understood exactly how little room the world was going to give you to be wrong. Black parents didn't invent the consequences. They were trying to prepare their children for them. That doesn't mean respectability politics was universally accepted within Black communities. It wasn't. Black thinkers and activists have debated for generations whether proving respectability could ever produce liberation from a system capable of simply moving the standard whenever Black people meet it. Because think about the bargain being offered. If I dress correctly, will you respect me? If I speak correctly, if I'm educated, if my job is good enough, if I never commit a crime, if I don't come off as angry, if I protest peacefully, if I just comply. At what point have I performed enough goodness to receive something that supposedly belonged to me already? And American history keeps giving us examples of who followed the damn rules and still encountered the boundary. Black Americans built businesses and accumulated wealth in Tulsa's Greenwood district. That didn't protect them when a white mob attacked the community in 1921. Killing people and destroying businesses. Black students trying to integrate schools were deliberately prepared to withstand insults and abuse without retaliating. That didn't stop crowds from screaming at children. Civil rights demonstrators trained in nonviolence. They were still beaten. John Lewis and other marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965 demanding voting rights. They weren't carrying weapons. Law enforcement attacked them anyway. So respectability could sometimes be a strategy. It could not guarantee safety. And that matters. Because be polite and maybe they'll listen sounds like advice about manners. Under unequal power, it can become a negotiation. I'll make my anger comfortable enough for you to hear if you'll finally acknowledge why I'm angry. I'll make my protests peaceful enough for you to tolerate if you'll consider what I'm protesting. I'll prove I'm one of the good ones if you'll stop treating me like one of the bad ones. But who keeps getting asked to perform? That's the part that I can't get away from. The person asking for change is often expected to control their anger, choose the right words, pick the right time, use the right tone, and make sure the people being challenged never become so uncomfortable that they stop listening. And sometimes that's strategic. Movements have always made strategic decisions about messaging, presentation, and tactics. Politics requires persuasion. If your goal is to change minds, how you communicate absolutely matters. But strategy and obligation are not the same thing. Someone can choose politeness because it helps them accomplish something. That's different from saying they have to be polite before their grievances deserve to be heard. Because once dignity becomes the reward for behaving correctly, whoever defines correctly still has the ruler. And we're right back where we started. So where does that leave us? We started with shh. Respect your elders. Don't be difficult. Don't talk about things that make people uncomfortable. Keep the peace. And maybe none of those lessons were ever as simple as they sounded. Because silence can be respect. It can be strategy. It can be maturity. It can even be survival. History makes it impossible for us to pretend everybody who stayed quiet simply lacked courage. There were people in this country who knew that speaking could cost them their job, their home, their safety, and sometimes their life. But silence can also become habit. You can spend so much time learning how to read the room that eventually you stop checking whether the room is right. That's where I think we get ourselves in trouble. We love to say, think for yourself. But thinking for yourself doesn't guarantee that you'll arrive at the same conclusion as the people around you. That's kind of the point. Sometimes thinking for yourself means realizing your side got something wrong. Sometimes standing on principle means refusing to compromise. Other times, standing completely still accomplishes nothing except giving you the satisfaction of saying you never moved. Compromise isn't inherently noble. Neither is refusing it. Speaking isn't inherently brave. Neither is silence. The meaning comes from what you're protecting. And I think that's what I want us to pay more attention to. When we say we're keeping the peace, whose peace are we keeping? When we say someone should be more respectful, would respect actually change what they're saying? Or would it just make what they're saying easier for us to swallow? When we refuse to compromise, what exactly would we have to surrender? And when everybody in the room agrees with us, are we still willing to check the ruler? Those are questions worth asking. Because America has spent a lot of time celebrating dissent after the dissent became safe. We love Martin Luther King Jr. now. We love the Freedom Riders now. We love the suffragist movement now. We love the worker who stood against exploitation and demanded higher wages now. History cleaned up the room for us. We know who won. We know which laws changed. We know which photographs made the textbook. We get to encounter courage after somebody else already paid the bill. Real life doesn't give us that luxury. You have to decide what you believe while everybody is still arguing. You have to decide whether to speak before you know how the room will react. You have to decide whether compromise moves something forward or abandons something that shouldn't be negotiable. And sometimes you have to admit that the person making you uncomfortable might have a point. That last one is a tough one. Because throughout this episode, we've talked about the pressure coming from parents, communities, political parties, institutions, and government. But sometimes you are the pressure. Sometimes you're the majority in the room. You're the parent. You're the boss. You're the friend whose approval matters. You're part of the political group somebody is afraid to challenge. You don't have to tell someone to shut up to teach them that you don't want to hear them. So finding your own voice isn't enough. You have to be able to live in a world where other people have one too. Not because they're always right. Not because every opinion deserves your respect. Not because every disagreement deserves compromise. But because freedom of thought means absolutely nothing if what we really want is freedom for everybody to independently arrive at our conclusions. So speak when you mean it. Be quiet when you choose it. Change your mind when the evidence earns it. Compromise when the outcome is worth what you're giving up. And stand your ground when it isn't. Just know the difference. We started this conversation believing the opposite of speaking was silence. I don't think it is. The opposite of speaking is having nothing you're allowed to say. And maybe peace is in a room where nobody is arguing. Maybe peace is a room where nobody has to be afraid to. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. And this has been You Ought to Know Better, the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. Until next time, know better, do better, be better. Good night.